Hey guys, Tony Rowe, back doing another awesome annotation. Or I think it's awesome. I was watching Tata Steel today. I usually don't get to watch it because I'm at work and I'm not at a computer. And so I spent most of the morning watching Tata Steel. And as soon as this game finished, I knew I had to put this on my channel. This is Aronian versus Giri. Aronian's white. Giri's black. And first of all, you have to feel, I think, a little bit bad for Anish Giri. Number one, he has a very bad score against Aronian, and Aronian is well known to have really, really awesome, powerful opening preparation as white, especially. So that's a tough pairing. But this is also his Giri's second black in a row, and his first black was versus Magnus Carlsen, and Carlsen pushed him really far yesterday. I think 117 moves or something like that, and Giri was losing. So maybe Giri's not having the best tournament, and two blacks in a row, and the second one, after being ground down against Carlsen, is against sort of his nemesis, Aronian. So Aronian opens with d4, c4, as he honestly almost always does. Sometimes he plays knight f3, sometimes he'll play the English, but he's mostly a diehard d4, c4 player. And Giri plays d5, transposes from what might presume to be a Queen's Indian or a Nimzo Bogo into the Queen's Gambit Decline. And Aronian plays a Catalan. And Giri selects bishop b4 check. This is a very popular move, very solid. Nowadays, at least for a while, it seemed like almost everyone out there was playing bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, and then they were playing d takes c4. And this line is extremely solid. Usually white goes queen c2. It's also possible to go knight e5, but queen c2 is the main line. And then after a6, white can go either a4 or queen takes c4. So on queen takes c4, black would go b5, queen c2, bishop b7. So occasionally, instead of allowing this, white players just decide to go a4 and stop that, and then only take on queen c4 the next move. Somewhat relevant to compare to the game would be here, instead of taking on c4, is just going c6 and then queen c2, knight b to d7, and then knight b to d2. And this is, I think, called the closed Catalan and is typically a little bit better for white, I think. Very few strong players actively go into this. They'd prefer to flick in the check first. And the reason is that after bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, c6, you get the same position, except white's bishop is poorly placed on the d2 square. White would like to put a knight here. It interferes with the queen's communication with the d-pawn and so on. And so usually white will have to waste a tempo putting this bishop on, let's say, f4 or slightly more rare e3 or g5. And here's one of the crazy things about this game is that in this position, let's open up the Opening Explorer for a hot second. In this position, white played a move that has, according to my database, only been played one time. People have been billing this move as a novelty. It's not. You just don't have the database technology that Tony Rowe has. And it's only been played one time, that move being knight a3. So it makes some sense. White protects the c4 square and just gets the knight off the back rank. But of course, this is, in general, if black doesn't do anything to it, a pretty crappy square for the knight. An interesting idea nonetheless, I think. And I hope that someone tries this move again and someone tries to improve on Giri's play so we get to see a little bit more of it. Way more normal here would be queen c2 and then knight b to d7, and white has quite a few moves. Bishop f4, rook d1 are the main ones, but some people go b3 or bishop g5 as well. Oh, I flicked on the Opening Explorer and you can't see it. I'm an idiot. Okay, but Aronian plays this almost novelty knight a3, and Giri just continues on with knight b to d7. It is possible to instead take on a3, but I think it's a little bit compliant. Yeah, white gets these two doubled A pawns, which are obviously not great. But the open B file is worth something, and most importantly, this dark squared bishop is now a monster. So black would be left with this pretty bad light squared bishop, given his central pawn structure, and white has the two bishops and an uncontested dark squared bishop, which sort of, I think, kind of is the most important facet of this position. And even after d takes c4, I don't think black can keep the pawn. Even something as simple as a4, just putting the a pawn to good use and following up with queen c2 and queen takes c4 is possible. And something like b5 takes, knight g5, exposing an attack on the rook. Knight d5 is forced, queen c2, threatening mate, g6, e4. This is quite good for white, I think. White could follow up with e5 and knight e4, and then go bishop h6 or bishop g5, or sometime down the road start chipping away even more at black's pawns with a4 again. So not to be recommended. It's also possible, I think, white can just sort of win back the pawn by force with bishop b4, rook e8, and then knight e5. And you can't stop knight takes c4 because b5 would be met by knight takes c6. So that's also possible. So Giri played knight b to d7, and another sort of odd thing for the Catalan, white goes rook c1. Again, more normal would be putting the queen on c2 instead, but once you put the knight on a3, actually there are some interesting subtleties that maybe point to rook c1 being more correct. The main one, I think, is that after knight to e4, which is a good exploitation of this knight being on this square, because it's no longer on this square and it doesn't stop knight e4. After bishop f4, black can go f5, and actually this queen is in the way of the maneuver white really wants to play, which would be knight c2 to e1 to d3. And if this knight were instead on d2, white could go knight e1 to d3 with this one, and then knight d2 to f3 with this one, and try and clamp down on this e5 square. But with the queen on c2, this knight is sort of stuck in this weird place on a3 and not really contributing much at all. And instead, if after knight e4, white tries what Aronian played in the game, bishop e3, then Giri's idea with bishop takes a3, b takes a3, knight d6 is a little bit more powerful here, because after c5, knight c4, white does not have the resource that he has in the game. And we'll see that in a second. You'll understand what I'm talking about real quickly in a second. I'm just making a small fix to the notation. There we go. Okay, so after knight b to d7, Aronian played rook c1. I think this is the best move. And Giri went knight e4. Very natural. Again, this knight does not cover e4. So, and it's very typical in the Catalan to at least think about stonewall structures with f5. And, excuse me, Aronian saves the bishop, wisely so. And this is kind of a critical moment in the opening, I think, where Giri has to sort of decide on a plan of attack. There are a lot of candidate moves here, I think, that are reasonable, and I'm not sure that Giri's bishop takes a3 is the best one. So he takes the knight, but I think based on how this game went, especially if someone repeats knight a3, I think black would be advised to choose something else. The most obvious one to me would be b6, and white has a couple of options. Maybe Giri did not want to deal with c takes d5 since rook takes c6 is threatened, e takes d5 is not possible, c takes d5, knight b5. Maybe he was worried about this. But I think either just the simple a6, knight c3 would be fine, but also just bishop b7 would be about equal. Instead, white can try and keep the tension with something like queen b3, and after bishop b7, rook d1, rook c8. I'm not sure white has a ton here. Just maybe c takes d5, e takes d5. Knight e5 would be unclear. Maybe knight e1 is possible, but again, I think most of these are equal. Again, if black doesn't take on a3 and white doesn't find a great way to put this piece to use, then I think it's just misplaced here. It's not doing much. So b6, I think, would be my suggestion. In the only other game that featured knight a3, black went f5. It was a correspondence game. And white went rook c2. The idea will become more clear, I think, in a second. Black went bishop d6, threatening to go f4 and start breaking open white's kingside, and white went queen c1, exclam, stopping it. And then after queen e7, bishop f4, white achieved the advantageous trade of dark squared bishops, which obviously leaves black with just his crappy light squared bishop. And I think after this, white was a little bit better. Black has some sort of nebulous attacking chances on the king side, but I think for the most part, h3 would shore up the weaknesses, and without a lot of firepower in that region, like these pieces aren't participating at all, white should be fine and can continue with his queenside play. And I believe that white won this correspondence game. Also note that in this position, if you go, well, rook c2, queen c1 is sort of odd, and if we're looking to stop f4, why not just play bishop f4 in this position to stop bishop d6? Well, if you go bishop f4 now, black can just go g5, and I think after, you almost have to go to d2, because if you go to e3, then f4 comes with another tempo, so yeah. So yeah, I think if white decided to repeat this and black found himself at this particular situation, I would not repeat Giri's bishop a3, ba3, knight d6 idea, and instead go for b6 or f5. But this is how the game went. And the idea is natural, of course. One idea for black is simply to go knight f5. Perfect square for the knight, and another would be to maybe, obviously black is threatening to take on c4, but if white went, let's say, knight d2, I think knight f5 would be very comfortable for black. So white sort of has to go c5, the point being that now knight f4, bishop f4 is probably just better for white. If after something like knight f6, knight e5, white would be more comfortable. Again, black has to figure out what to do with this bishop. At the risk of just ad nauseum saying that throughout this whole video, it's sort of the overriding theme of this game in general. So white goes c5, and after knight c4, this is kind of a critical moment for white. So if you want, take a minute, stop, think what you'd play. Okay, Aronian went rook takes c4. I think this is an absolutely brilliant move. And after d takes c4, went queen c2. Of course, white just threatens to take back on c4 with excellent compensation, but also there are some knight g5 sort of tricks lurking. For instance, if b6 or b5, b6 chipping away at the center, or b5 threatening to, well, just intending to keep the pawn, then knight g5 threatens both mate and the c6 pawn at the same time, and white would be quite a bit better, probably close to winning. And similarly, after something like e5, trying to just break out into the center, there's knight g5, g6, knight e4, and white has greatly improved the position of his knight, which might head to d6, and black has a bunch of dark squared weaknesses he has to worry about, so also not to be recommended. I think because of all these knight g5 tricks, Giri just decided to make the prophylactic h6 move, and after queen takes c4, I think we reach another critical position for Giri. So if we just take stock here for a quick second, white already has really excellent compensation for the exchange. He's got a pawn. It's a d pawn, but really the c pawn is the most relevant. The double a pawns are not at all a real factor, and in fact the open b file ends up being quite useful. But the big things are the differences between black's dark squared bishop on c8, which is very bad, and white's dark squared bishop, which is going to end up on the d6 square, which will obviously be completely dominant, and black's really lagging queenside development. So for the one pawn deficit, white has a ton of compensation. You could imagine if the bishop makes it to d6, white puts the pawn on e4, or the rook on b1, the positional compensation would be pretty overwhelming. So for Giri, I think this is a critical moment where he has to realize that if he doesn't do anything, white will just slowly improve his position and he'll end up lost before, sooner rather than later, if white's allowed to improve uncontested. So I think Giri's obviously a world-class player. He realizes this, and he decides to go b6, which I think is a mistake. It's a very natural move, and it makes a lot of sense. Black needs to open up the game, and it also kind of prepares maybe if this queen moves, bishop a6 immediately, or a5, bishop a6, for instance. So black is both trying to open lines for his extra rook and develop his bad dark squared bishop. So b6 really does strike at the heart of the position, but it doesn't quite work out the way I think he thought it would. White still ends up keeping this dark squared bishop under control and keeping the position under control. b6 doesn't quite cut it. Now with access to computers and hindsight and the ability to take moves back and things like that, I'd recommend e5 instead. The idea is that after something like knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, there's just bishop e6. When black gave up another pawn, but now he gets to smoothly complete his development and not have many problems. Instead, if white takes with the d pawn immediately and wisely does not trade these knights off, black can go something like queen e7, bishop d4, and either rook e8, queen c3, b6, or just b6 immediately. And I think this is a little bit better of an attempt to break out than what Giri got in the game. So yeah, that's probably, I actually think in this position b6 is Giri's biggest mistake of the game, probably. And after bishop f4, rook e8, bishop d6, it's already very difficult for Giri to get out. So after bishop b7, where else are you going to put it? Knight e5, b takes c5, d takes c5. You can see kind of the stark contrast in piece quality. And Giri manages to exchange off the bishop and go a5, again sort of hinting at bishop a6, but after rook b1, I think it turns out that bishop a6 is not a big deal anyway. For instance, Giri played rook a7, I think for lack of anything else to do, really. But I think he wanted to use it along the 7th rank, and he wanted to put this bishop back on either a8 or c8, maybe a6 still. But after rook b1, bishop a6, there's just queen c2, and c6 is weak. So you can't go bishop b5 because of a4. And if you go queen d7, there's just rook b6, and you either go back to b7 with your bishop to protect c6, or you go rook e to c8. And it's hard to sort of determine which one is worse, because after even a do-nothing move like a4, is having the bishop on a6 worth having the rest of your queenside pieces kind of corralled in passive positions? So it's kind of hard to decide which one is worse. Giri goes rook a7, and Aronian starts to turn the screws on the other side of the board. And that's kind of a well-known facet of positional chess and a way to improve your position and try and make your opponent crack. Yeah, and when you've improved kind of to the max on one side of the board, for instance, are these pieces really getting any better? And you feel like you've kind of achieved the maximum amount of concessions, the principle is that you can more efficiently switch to the other side of the board with more space and better placed pieces than your opponent can react. So And usually if you just try and hunker down on one weakness, your opponent can just hunker down on one weakness too and defend, whereas if you open up a second front, it's usually quite a bit harder for him to defend. So, let's make this a quiz, actually, because I think it's an instructive move. Decide what you'd play here. Okay. Aronian went to queen c3, essentially forcing f6, and then the bishop goes back to d6, and we can see the damage that's been done. Of course, black has made probably, one or two pawn moves too many around his king, and also severely weakened this b1 to h7 diagonal, which after bishop a8, Aronian starts to kind of point to immediately. Of course, bishop g6 is a threat and would win back an exchange immediately. I doubt, even if he put his bishop on g6, that Aronian would take a rook, but Giri goes f5 anyway, and Aronian transfers the bishop to c2. So now there are ideas lurking of either putting the bishop on b3 or blowing open this diagonal again and leading with the queen in some kind of simple mating attack. So black tries to use the rook on a7, and white obviously declines. When you have more space like this in a dominant position, it doesn't make a lot of sense to exchange rooks, especially when this rook on d1 is quite a bit better than this rook on b7. Black goes rook d7, and white blows open the position with f4. And probably around here it starts to just be, I think you could safely evaluate this as winning for white or pretty close to it. You can sort of look already, black is up material, but the quality of his material is really quite bad compared to the quality of white's material, and of course the kingside weaknesses are also pretty telling. So Giri figures, I might as well try and exchange queens. Aronian's obviously not going to let that happen. I think honestly queen takes f6 was probably still playable. Queen a5 is playable. Queen e3 is probably quite good. Almost anything is good here. Aronian goes queen c4, threatening e takes f5 due to this pin. Giri goes king h8, rook e1. Again, threatening e takes f5 due to now a pin along the e file. Black goes queen f7. And Aronian goes queen d3, amping up the pressure on the f5 square. Now e takes f5, e takes f5, rook e8, queen takes f5 would be completely decisive. And something like f takes e4, queen e4 is just not, I think, even remotely advisable, opening up this diagonal. And so in this position, Giri decides to just chuck the pawn with f4, and Aronian, of course, just takes it. And Giri goes e5, which is actually a clever resource. And it must be what he had in mind when he plays f4, because otherwise you might not just chuck this pawn for nothing. So Giri goes e5, and Aronian goes queen h3, which I think is maybe slightly an inaccuracy because it allows rook takes d6. So typically when you're down, or when you're up material in chess and you're facing an attack, you're always kind of wanting to look for ways to liquidate, give that material back for some kind of advantage. Here, Giri's just trying to survive, so he picks this as the moment where it's best for him to give back that exchange. On the basis that c takes d6, queen g6, queen g3, queen takes d6 at least wins the pawn back. This is how the game went. It turns out that it's not quite good enough. Going back a little bit, after e5, I think it was much better to just go f5. Of course, this both stops the queen g6, rook d6 stuff, but also, it just sort of, black has no moves, and after maybe a do-nothing move like bishop b7, f4 is just completely crushing. Of course, f takes e5 or bishop takes e5 will come, and if black takes, then e5 is just completely paralyzing. E6 or f6 is coming, and the game just ends instantly. So I think probably this f5 move was a little bit more convincing, but queen h3, rook d6, this whole forcing line does not really spoil the game anyway. So Aronian goes 35 rook d1, and Giri just puts his queen on a very natural square, hits the bishop. But I think actually this move is probably the final mistake, because after rook d7, threatening queen takes g7 mate, rook g8, bishop b3, Black has to chuck more material, and I think there's just nothing really left to play for here for Black except for just cheap tricks. Again, due to the fact that this bishop is just so bad, and now after White wins the exchange back, he'll actually be up material. So Giri went e takes f4, and Aronian just kept the threats on g7 and g8 and f3, so the cheapo queen c1 mate threat. Aronian did not fall for it, 39 h4, queen c3, looking to get into queen e1, and then queen takes f2 check, bishop takes g8, queen e1, king h2, queen f2, king h3, and there's no mate on g2 because of the queen, and after queen f1, king g4, Giri resigned because king h5 is possible after queen g1, and there's no more checks. And Black is just down way too much material. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think it was really a really excellent, almost perfectly played game by Aronian from start to finish. Starting with this funny pseudo-novelty on move 8, which surely threw the always very well-prepared Giri into a deep think. And then, of course, this wonderful idea with c5, rook takes c4. And then just really, Aronian did a great job of increasing his advantage with moves like queen c3, bishop e4 to c2, and then finally blowing open the position with e4, after which I think the game pretty much just ended. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you like more of these annotated games. This one I saw, I just had to analyze it more myself, and I wanted you guys to see it and appreciate it if you hadn't seen it yet. But if you're interested, let me know. There will always be more if that's what people want. I hope you guys had a good weekend. It's Sunday at maybe 4 o'clock Tony time,